The 12 theses. The first one is that tragedy is an invention. Right? It's a political invention, a literary invention, and what we might call a psychical invention. What I mean by that is that tragedy, and this is following on from the work of Vernon and Vidal-Naquet closely, tragedy is the putting on stage of the city. It's the spectacle of the city. There's a term that was used in, and this raises a really interesting question. There's a term that's used by Plato, and I forget which dialogue, it might be in the Laws, where he refers to theatrocratia, theatrocracy, right? Power, the power of theatre, or a political organisation based on theatre, and which is linked for Plato to the other word, demokratia. Right? There's an interesting link between theatre and democracy. And as we know, philosophy is at war with democracy. Right? From Plato onwards, through to our friend Badiou. It's at war with a certain notion of democracy. With the exception of who? John Dewey, one or two others. So tragedy is the putting of the city on stage, where theatre and democracy are somehow linked. There's a really interesting question which we could link to contemporary theories of democracy about the nature of ambiguity in relation to democracy. We might want to say, with someone like Claude Lefort or Ernesto Laclau, that democracy is the dissolution of the markers of certitude. Right? Democracy is a political form of life based upon contestation. And to that extent, any regime that claims to be premised on the truth, which is how it would appear Plato is making the argument for his regime in the Republic, is the enemy of democracy. It's a thought. So, and it's certainly one of the ways in which tragedy is attacked by Plato. Democracy, theatocracy, and democracy, insofar as it's governed by spectacle, will lead to tyranny. Of course, that's not wrong, right? In a very, contemporary sense, we could translate that into straightforwardly situationist discourse. Right? That democracy becomes spectacle, it becomes theatre, it becomes media, and that's the way in which tyranny acts itself out. Berlusconi, whatever it might be. Italy has become a theatocracy, a mediocrity, and all the rest.
We lost.
That's right. That's right. It's a political invention with ambiguous consequences. It's a literary invention in the sense in which what's peculiar about tragedy is that unlike the other two forms that it's always linked to, epic and lyric, it's a public event. Right? Epic poetry was probably performed on a kind of guitar type thing with a few people probably having a drink. Lyric poetry seems to have been performed by a poet for probably quite small audiences. Theatre is an invention of, it's mass media. Theatre is mass media in its time, in terms of the percentage of the population of the city of Athens that were there to watch the spectacle. The spectacle of the city acting itself out, performing itself. Psychical invention, I won't go into this now, but Vernon has this idea of what he calls tragic consciousness, which he thinks is invented with Greek theatre. And it's the idea that the tragic consciousness is that what the spectator sees in theatre is not some it does not experience some straightforward identification or precognitive immersion in ritual, but the spectator sees the ambiguity, the constitutive ambiguity of life in the city. Constitutive ambiguity of life in the city. And the spectator is themselves divided against themselves. Right? So for Vernon, the invention of Greek tragedy is the invention of an internally divided self-consciousness. Right? Which sounds banal, but then you read book after book, Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind, Bruno Schnell's Discovery of the Mind. The Greeks did not have self-consciousness. They had consciousness, but for self-consciousness we have to wait until St. Paul and St. Augustine. Christianity, it's nonsense. The Greeks. Anyway. So, second thesis is that linked to it is tragedy is not the expression of a ritual, it's a practice premised upon a temporal disjunction, specifically the disjunction of the past and the present. This is important. The time of tragedy, ancient and modern, is always out of joint. The meaning of that is that the this is the third thesis, so let's just say that and I'll explain both. Tragedy is self-consciously anachronistic. It disrupts the order of historical time. So what we have in tragedy are characters from what for the Greeks was ancient history, the Mycenaean period. People back in the day who believed that weird shit about the gods. Right? Those people appearing in the present and engaging in rhetorical debates, in the present, legal debates. And so what we get in tragedy is not some reflection of the past, right? And it's not some reflection of the present, it's some experience of disjunction between the past and the present. It's as if the two orders are in some sort of relation of disarticulation. And I would argue the same thing is at work in Shakespearean tragedy. Think about Hamlet. Hamlet is about the experience of a past, a mythic past, when kings were kings, right? When the state was properly ordered, when it wasn't rotten, and the disjunction with that condition when the usurper king is on the throne and everything has been thrown to hell. Right? We find the same conflict in, say, King Lear. It's in the order of, as well, what people call a feudal idea of kingship and a modern idea. So somehow, in the experience of tragedy, is always this play between the past and the present, and the two things sort of colliding in a way that doesn't lead to their reconciliation, but leads to their, I don't know, questioning, fragmentation. The time is out of joint. The fourth thesis is that tragedy is the self-consciousness of fictionality. I would explain that. The fifth thesis, which I've also partially explained, is that the subject of tragedy is not the tragic hero, but the city-state. Specifically the city-state in its novel, litigious ambiguity, in its breakage with the past. This is an important point. Vernon and Vidal-Naquet's book is called Myth and Tragedy in Ancient Greece, in ancient tragedy, myth and tragedy. The point being that tragedy is not myth. Tragedy is that aesthetic, political phenomenon that takes place when myth breaks down. Myth no longer has a hold over people's lives. So what we see in tragedy, according to them, and I think it's persuasive, is the residue of myth, the leftover of myth, that washes up into a society that's not governed by myth but governed by law. So, a word about law, because throughout tragedy you'll find legal debates. The Oresteia ends with a legal debate. We'll say more about that. Any citizen of the city of Athens, which meant any property-owning male, of course, could engage in a legal contestation of a claim, and they did it frequently. It was a society which is the infinite superiority of the ancient Greeks over us, a society without lawyers. Right? People took their own cases to court, and the cases were heard. There was a Supreme Court which did murder cases, but people just basically sued each other very regularly. It was a very litigious society, but a society without lawyers. The importance of sophistry in the 5th century was to allow citizens to become skilled in legal debate, to argue a case. Right? The opposition, and the opposition that you find in Plato to this is very clear. I wrote a piece about this in the Times last year on the image of the philosopher versus the image of the lawyer. Socrates will say in the Theaetetus that the philosopher is a stranger to the law court. And if the philosopher tries to defend him or herself in legal terms, they'll fail, which is of course what happened to Socrates. He presented himself to the law court and the case failed. There's an essential disjunction between the experience of law and litigious contestation and philosophy. We'll explore that. But the point being is that tragedy is about the breakdown of the order of myth in a society that's become one governed by law. Right? Not, therefore, so different from our modern societies. Right? We think about, say, North American societies, a society obviously governed by law, and a litigious society at that, but one for whom the past of myth is one that's no longer believed in, but it still functions as a residue, a vocabulary, an archive of possibility. Think about, say, the phenomenon of the Western, right? Which is really the American analogue to Greek tragedy. I think John Ford is very Aeschylean, right? In the way, in the sense in which you know exactly what's going to happen. There's no suspense. You know there's going to be a gunfight. You know who's going to die. From the beginning, these are stories, these are myths that we all know, and they're myths that have already been broken down in relationship to the technology of cinema and the society to which they were being distributed. To that extent, what was going on in ancient Greek tragedy was not so different. This is part of my attempt to de-exoticize the ancient Greeks. What thesis have we all now got? Six thesis. Thesis number 6 is that tragedy is the experience of moral ambiguity, and I'm going to explain that in a second or two. Oh, damn it, I'll explain it now, because it would make more sense. What do I mean by that? Okay, there's a quotation on your sheet from Vernon and Vidal-Naquet, which I think is very helpful. This is actually Vernon. What tragedy depicts is one decay, one claim to justice, in conflict with another. A law that is not fixed, shifting and changing into its opposite. What Lyotard called a différend, right? A conflict, a legal dispute. It's exactly this concept. To be sure, tragedy is something quite different from a legal debate. It takes as its subject the man, forgive the French for that, a human being or something, person, actually living out this debate, forced to make a decisive choice to orient his activity in a universe of ambiguous values where nothing is ever stable or unequivocal. So, the meaning of justice, or the meaning of law, in Greek tragedy is something that is constantly shifting. It's subject to ambiguous reversals. Obvious example of this is the Antigone. No? The key term in the Antigone is not decay, justice, but convention, law, norm, the word nomos. And Antigone's claim is that the governing nomos is the following. The family buries its dead. Right? That's the law. That's the custom. Right? Crayon's claim is that the traitor shall remain unburied because he's an enemy of the state. That's the nomos. Right? And those two nomoi are presented in conflict, and that's the drama. Where is the truth? Vernon's claim, which I'm inclined to at least think through, is that the truth lies in the ambiguity of the claim. We watch a word, a concept twist from one thing into something else, and twist back. Right? It's not that Antigone is right, or Crayon is right, they're both right. And tragedy is the presentation of a collision between those two claims to what is right. Right? When we get to Hegel, that basically is the essence of Hegel's claim about tragedy. Tragedy is a collision between two claims to what is just. Right? And that can go two ways. That can lead to destruction, which is how he thinks about the Antigone, or it can lead to reconciliation. The world of tragedy is a world of ambiguity, a world without certainty, a world where questions always seem to be open, and the wound of the past bleeds into the uncertain present. I'll talk more about that as we go on. Because if it's about the disjunction of the past and the present, tragedy is about the way in which the past acts on our present without us being aware of it. Right? I'm Oedipus, the king. Some call me great. Right? I solve riddles. You are not who you seem. Queer man Tiresias says to him, you are the murderer you seek. And we watch him unravel. Right? We watch, and what we're aware of as a spectator, and this is tragic consciousness, we're aware of this whole situation. We know what's going to happen. We know the truth of Oedipus. We watch him go through the process by which it's discovered. And the past acts on us in ways in which we cannot control. Right? And that's the function of prophecy in tragedy. And I think the psychoanalytic implications of that are, I think, incredibly powerful, meaning that we are acted upon by a past in the present of which we are not conscious. Okay, in what does the power of ambiguity, in what does the power of ancient tragedy consist, or indeed modern tragedy consist? I think it consists, this is still thesis 6, in the ability to bear moral ambiguity. Justice is on both sides, and one is swayed one way and then the other. The truth of tragedy, the truth of its deception, right, the truth of its untruth, going back to Gorgias, consists in bearing ambiguity. Bearing it, literally, is bearing it like a weight. Justice is not one, it is at least two. Right? Maybe more than two. And the experience of tragedy is the experience of justice twisting into its opposite in a situation. To give you an example, a concrete example, the other text on that page you have is, forget the Prometheus Bound, that's just from the book I copied it from, but you've got there on the left side, page 130, the last page of Aeschylus's drama, Seven Against Thebes, which most people consider to be a particularly dull play, but actually it's fascinating. It's always the same stories, right? Always the same stories. It's Thebes. The two brothers have engaged in a mortal combat. They're both dead, Eteocles and Polynices. And the two sisters, Antigone and Ismene, have shared their loyalty one way to both of them. Have you got it? It's just the page, it's got Prometheus Bound on one side and then, yeah. So the play comes to an end. And also what's fascinating about this page, this would have been the last play in a trilogy. And the other two plays are lost. So this is the end of a tragic trilogy. Now, there's a certain view, if there's a view about tragedy which takes it back to the question of the birth, Dionysian worship, there's another view of tragedy, which is tragedy is about conflict and reconciliation. Right? This is one version of how we understand Hegel. It's more complicated than that, but Hegel does say that. Tragedy is about reconciliation. I would contest, here's an example of reconciliation not happening, and it happens all over the place. So forget the play, the chorus, let's say us, at the end of the play, make the following thing. Chorus, alas, alas, O high vaunting ruin to the race, fatal furies who have destroyed the race of Oedipus so utterly. His sons have slaughtered you. What will happen to me? What shall I do? What shall I plan? That is the question of tragedy. What shall I do? You find that over and over again. People do not know how to act. They don't know what to do. Right? Socrates never knows not what. He always knows what to do. Maybe he doesn't want to discuss things because he's happier looking at boys in the gymnasium. Yeah, that's his way. But you know, you know that he knows, even though he says he doesn't know. But people in tragedy, I've got no idea what to do. How shall I be so harmless? So the chorus, they've got two corpses on stage, Polynices and Eteocles. Which way do they go? Who's the right choice to make here? And they say that both claims have justice. Look, how should I be so fearless not to mourn for you, not to give escort to your funeral, Polynices? But I fear the dreadful authority of the people. I'm turned from my purpose. And then to Eteocles, many mourners you shall wish. They're divided. And then what happens? This is completely amazing. The chorus divides into two. It divides into two halves. Right? And one half says, sides with one brother, the other half sides with the other brother. Look, first half chorus, let the state do or do not what it will to the mourners of Polynices, we will go and bury him. This is the Antigone side. We will go as his escort. The grief is common to the race, but now one way or now another, the city approves the path of justice. The other half of the chorus is, but we will go with the other, as the city and justice jointly improve. For after the blessed ones and the strength of Zeus, he is the one who saved the city from utter destruction, from being overwhelmed by the wave of foreign invaders. So what we have here at the end of this play is in, let's say, Lyotard's terms, the straightforward articulation of a différend, a conflict, right? And no attempt to reconcile a conflict. We're presented with a situation of absolute ambiguity. Both claims are right, both claims are just, and the question is, what shall I do? Well, we'll divide up. You go this way, I'll go that way. It's sort of amazing. There's other examples that I could give, which would be where where we see, another example from Aeschylus, the Suppliant Maidens, which also is a play that everybody considers really boring, but it's brilliant. And the Suppliant Maidens are a bunch of women from Egypt who claim a Greek lineage and ask for refuge because they're being threatened with detention and rape in North Africa, which, as you know, has been rather common in the last few months. And they come and claim refuge in Greece. And in that play, there's another example. In that play, the central term is kratos, power. And the suppliant maidens from Greece say, well, given that we're Greeks and have Greek blood, you will give us refuge. And the king says, no, that's not the way it works around here. We're democrats. I'll have to put this to the people. If they decide that it's okay, then you can stay. So in that play, there's a direct difference between an idea of blood, power based on blood, and power based on democratic authority. And we could go on and multiply the examples, but this is sort of a way of amplifying that little quote from Vernon. That's thesis 6. Thesis 7 is that tragedy is gender trouble. I've sort of explained that, but I mean, we'll come back to that. But I'm piling up at least three sort of things that I've read and been very influenced by. Anne Carson's work, her translations of Euripides, and her other work, which is stunning, I think, and her poetry. Nicole Laureau's Tragic Ways of Killing a Woman, and other texts by her, and Judith Butler's Antigone's Claim, and some more recent things by her. And I sort of mentioned this before, but Judith's claim is that Antigone is gender trouble. Right? Antigone is not the essential feminine or some heroic idea of femaleness or woman. She is someone that flips one way and the other. And furthermore, she's a monster as well. You wouldn't exactly want Antigone in your class or dinner table or whatever. She's trouble. And just when you think you've got her, she'll flip into something else. Ismene will say, oh, I understand. Okay, no, don't share my grief with me. Piss off. You can share my suffering. So we'll come back to that question of gender. The 8th thesis is a important one. How do we understand the relationship between the humans and the gods in tragedy? Question mark. If you read Greek tragedy, or indeed many other works of drama, it would appear alien to us because there are these gods all over the place, performing magic tricks, doing this or that, having their way with people. One view, which is a very powerful view, is that the Greeks were children. Right? This is the view that Marx articulates in the introduction to the Grundrisse. Marx says two extraordinary things in the introduction to the Grundrisse. He says, on the one hand, and this is it's a complicated claim. He says, how do we reconcile Achilles with powder and shot? Right? How do we reconcile Homeric epic with the printing press in the 19th century? He's thinking about how do we reconcile antiquity and modernity. He says Greek art should no longer make a claim on us because it's a world that no longer exists. Yet, he says, it is the norm of art and art's unreachable standard. That's Marx. And how does it do that? because the Greeks were normal children. Right? We're adults, but they're normal children. Now, and these normal children believed in God and gods. This is a rather patronising view of the situation. So my claim is that the tragic coupling of the human and the divine is not some pre-modern, superstitious or supernatural residue that culminates in the achievement of autonomy. I'll try to explain this as we go on, or the triumph of the will. What the gods are doing in ancient Greek tragedy is they are the representatives of forces that are outside of human control. Representative of forces that are outside of human control. Let me try and explain myself a little better here. The presence of the gods, fate, or supernatural forces need not scare us. What is being articulated here are forces, structures, and circumstances outside of our control. Napoleon said to Goethe, apparently, that what fate was in the ancient world, politics is in the modern world. Right? So, our experience of something that's outside of our control would, let's say, be the political system, the social political system that we find ourselves in. That interpolates us, right, as subjects without us as subjects having chosen it. We find ourselves thrown into a linguistic, social, political, economic system that's not of our choosing. What the gods mean for the Greeks is something closer to that. Another way of thinking about it would be that the role of the gods in ancient tragedy is a placeholder for a force or forces that exceed, yet determine, and can destroy human agency. And another part of this project, some way down the line, there'll be a discussion of Ibsen, of Henrik Ibsen. And Ibsen, it seems to me, understood this perfectly. And Ibsen, anyway, the point that if you take a play like Ibsen's Ghosts, right? It's famous and at the time shocking play, Ghosts. The role of the gods, the role of fate, has become transformed into a sexually transmitted disease. It's a sexually transmitted disease of tertiary syphilis that the father has visited on the son through the father's behaviour, and which the son discovers himself contaminated by, and which kills him. Right? The play is called Ghosts, and Mrs. Alving, right, the heroine of the play, this happens so often in theatre, in the behaviour of the son sees the ghost of the father, and this is both extremely tragic and disturbing. Another example from Ibsen, just to show how this idea of the gods can be translated out. There's a wonderful play that was performed in Ban, in Brooklyn in January, called John Gabriel Borkman. It was performed in Dublin before then by Ibsen. And in that play, we could, it's in the box, and we could talk about it. The role of the gods becomes the power of capital itself, the power of money. And the John Gabriel Borkman character is a character who thinks he can commune. His perversion is he thinks he can commune with the silver and gold in the hills. And he has this vision of a world of trade, a world of capital, as it were, at work. And he's destroyed in the process. The point being is that what the gods meant to the Greeks is not something, it's not something we can sort of jettison and say these people were children and we're now adults, but different experiences of forces can be brought to bear on our lives. Or, as it's said in the great movie Magnolia, right? On numerous occasions, as the man says, you may be through with the past, but the past isn't through with you. Right? And what we watch in tragedy after tragedy is the past having its way with us. The significant ninth thesis, we're getting there. I'm doing something a bit different than I thought I would do, but that's the fun of doing this. The ninth thesis is the significance of tragedy cannot be explained away through some progressivist philosophy of history. Let me take a couple more quotes here, because they're good and I don't want to lose them. Okay. If you go to this page here, there's two long quotes there. The first one is from, so the one at the bottom is from Vernon. Now, I won't read the whole quote because I don't want to go over too long. But the point, and the bit that interests me is the bottom of page 46, the top of page 47. So you can read that for yourself. But Vernon says, the last line on page 46, the tragic sense of responsibility makes its appearance at the point when, in human action, a place is given to internal debate on the part of the subject, to intention and premeditation. But when this human action has still acquired enough consistency and autonomy to be entirely self-sufficient. Right? So Vernon is brilliant. But the claim he makes there is that Greek tragedy looks the way it does because the Greeks did not have autonomy. Right? And we moderns have autonomy. Hurrah! Right? And that's why... so there's an idea of a progressivist narrative here. They've still not acquired the autonomy and self-sufficiency that we assume is axiomatic for what it means to be human. Now, on this view of the ancient Greeks can be spun in two ways. One is Hegelian and one is Nietzschean or Heideggerian. On the Hegelian view, the Greeks were fantastic, liked them a lot, but history is the becoming self-conscious of freedom, right? And that requires modernity, right? And modernity has to be gone through. The Greeks didn't have that. So the Greek insight into ethical life requires a progressivist narrative history to be consummated in the experience of freedom, the Hegelian picture, which is sort of implicit in what Vernon says. The other view is that the lack of autonomy the Greeks had is actually an advantage. They're not poisoned by our self-consciousness and belief in self-sufficiency. They could, in their ritual behaviour, engage in a sort of ecstatic identification with each other and overcome the principle of individuation and merge with the primal unity of being. This is Nietzsche's argument in The Birth of Tragedy. And that would be a sort of regressivist conception of history. I think both these conceptions are deeply flawed. And I'm going to try and argue against them as we go through. So what do I suggest as an alternative? Which quotation shall I take? Well, let me give you thesis 10 and then I'll come back and explain the progress thing as well. Thesis 10 is that tragedy reveals a world only partially intelligible to human agency. Tragedy reveals a world only partially intelligible to human agency. And the person that I've got in mind who might be a surprising choice, is the English philosopher Bernard Williams, who wrote a book called Shame and Necessity. And it's a fascinating book. And Williams basically dismantles that progressivist idea of history. the idea that there's an evolution from antiquity to us, and wants to make the following claim. Okay, let me find the right. Just read this. Williams basically defends Vernon's idea of tragic consciousness, but removes any evolutionism or progressivism from it. He uses it to identify and contest what is arguably the central presupposition of the major tradition in the history of philosophy. He writes, and this is page, the quotation on page 166, so just above the one from Vernon. Bernard Williams writes, "We are in an ethical condition that lies not only beyond Christianity, but beyond its Kantian and Hegelian legacies." Just flip over from that quotation to, there's another quotation on the other side of the same page. Also from Shem and Cecil, you can find that. It's page 9 on this page here. This is Bernard Williams. He says, to elucidate that quote, "Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel are all on the same side, all believing in one way or another that the universe or history or the structure of human reason can, when properly understood, yield a pattern that makes sense of human life and human aspirations." Right? This, for Williams, is the philosophical delusion. The idea that we could find a principle, or a basis, rationality, whatever it might be, from which we could understand the whole picture. An Archimedean point from which we can turn the whole universe in Descartes' formulation. So to go back to the quote I interrupted. So Williams, again, like Nietzsche, sees Kant and Hegel in continuity with Christianity. He says, we have an ambivalent sense of what human beings have achieved and have hopes for how they might live, in particular in the form of a still powerful ideal that they should live without lies. Strange heritage of Christianity that we still have. Why should we want to believe or like to believe that human beings are sincere, truthful? But Williams says that's a powerful belief. We know, I think this is brilliant, we know that the world was not made for us, or we for the world. There's just a universe, and it's contingent, and it's out there, and it's sort of scary and big. And our history tells us no purposive story, and that there is no position outside the world or outside history from which we might hope to authenticate our activities. Right? There's no God's eye view. The world isn't for us, the universe isn't for us, history has no particular shape and purpose, and there's no position outside of it from which we can stand. We have to acknowledge the hideous costs of many human achievements that we value. Right? Civilization is, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism, as Benjamin would say, including this reflective sense itself. That's amazing, right? This is very Hamlet. Hamlet, at a certain moment in Act 2, sort of turns into Agamben. Right? He says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Denmark's a prison. And they go, no, it's not, it's great, you've got good dairy products and castles and great places to go on holiday. He said, no, the world is a prison. To me, the world is a prison. And he says, Hamlet says, there is neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. There is neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Meaning that the reflection, the to be or not to be moment, is something which is a kind of curse. Okay. and recognise that there is no redemptive Hegelian history or universal Leibnizian cost-benefit analysis to show that it will come out well enough in the end. All will be well. In important ways, this is the payoff, we are, in our ethical situation, more like human beings in antiquity than any people have been in the meantime. Right? This is the claim, which I think is it true? Is it not? I don't know. It's something that invites a certain thinking. We're not Christians, right? We've lost that. We've seen where that particular will to truth takes one. And Williams's argument would be that to be a Kantian or Hegelian is just to secularize that Christianity in another philosophy of history, another theodicy, where it's all going to turn out for the best. Freedom at the end of history, or the moral law, the starry heavens above me, the moral law within me, whatever it might be. Or indeed, we might add Marx to that list. So we're more like these creatures than anyone's been in the meantime, because these narratives, if you like, as Lyotard put, these grand narratives have dropped away. More particularly, we are like those who, from the 5th century and earlier, have left us traces of a consciousness that has not yet been touched by Plato's and Aristotle's attempts to make our ethical relations to the world fully intelligible. I mean, this is done in a very sort of mild-mannered English way, but it's a devastating claim, a really interesting claim. I mean, there's no question of a return to the Greeks here. There's no question of a fantasy of a rebirth of what the Greeks had in a rebirth of tragedy, the kind that possessed the young Nietzsche. But the recognition here is more sober, I think. We find ourselves in a situation where the belief that human reason, if you're a Kantian, or reason plus God if you're a Thomist, or reason plus affect if you're a Spinozist, or reason plus history if you're a Hegelian, or whatever it might be, that any of these approaches might yield a pattern or a system that would make sense of human life, human actions, and human aspirations. All that has to be given up, Williams's claim. Good, isn't it? I mean, so this is the philosophical delusion. As Williams writes, Sophocles and Thucydides are alike in leaving us with no sense. Right? So the idea is that history tells us no purposive story. If only a God can save us, as Heidegger says, then we know deep down that there is no such thing. The world was not made for us, nor we for the world. It's a marriage made neither in heaven nor in nature. And no totalizing theory or complete theory of everything is going to satisfy our urge to make sense of the whole. Right? Maybe what has to be given up is our urge to make sense of the whole. And if you think about, and again, it's a thing that you find if you read this work I do for the Times. What's most interesting are the responses you get from readers. And the readers, you'll often find this extraordinary desire to make sense of the whole. Often through a sort of minestrone of cosmology, neuroscience, and Buddhism. That's the current constellation. And it's not wrong. It's a powerful urge. And it's the urge that feeds a certain philosophical conception. Right? I'm suspicious of any such attempt. Whatever it might be, and therefore, so this is, I don't know whether this is crazy or not, but if you found something that you think explains the whole, then you should doubt it. It's what I call the one big thing theory. If you found a one big thing that explains everything, then it must be wrong. There must be some counter-concept. It can't all be fucking power. It can't all be, a plane of immanence, infinitely infinite. It has to be an opposite to that. There's something wrong with thinking that way. It can't all be being, right, in its destinal unfolding. That is, in a sense, not very far from the minestrone of neuroscience, Buddhism, and cosmology. Okay? What's presented in tragedy is something rather different. It's what we might call skepticism. So the view I want to propose to try and wrap things up was thesis 10. Oh, it's thesis 11, good lord. There has to be thesis 11. Hitherto philosophers have interpreted the world. No, it's not. How does it go? This is all in pen I wrote yesterday. Tragedy, the mood of ancient tragedy is skeptical. And maybe the mood of modern tragedy is skeptical. It's about the dissolution of the markers of certitude, which finds expression in questions. What shall I do? What shall I plan? What now? Right? So in tragedy we find people wandering around, usually in the chorus, not knowing what to do, watching some human being having destroyed themselves. Right? So, in my view, rather than being sort of Dionysian ecstatics, what's going on in the spectacle of ancient tragedy, I think in the spectacle of contemporary, in Shakespearean tragedy and contemporary tragedy, and indeed contemporary spectacle, is something like an experience of skepticism. And I'll try and elaborate that. And I don't see that as a disabling thought. I see that as an enormously mobilizing thought. Accepting what we do not know. It's not a condition for paralysis, it's a condition for action. I would like to think. And then the last thesis, and this can take us to the last quotation. This is on page 11 of the sheet, so opposite the Bernard Williams Shame and Necessity quotation. It's the quotation beginning, "Tragedy conveys." This is something we're going to be thinking through as we move along. But so to go back to the schema, the schedule, tragedy is about, for me, the limitation, the acceptance of the limitation of the claims to autonomy and the claims to self-sufficiency. In Butlerian terms, right? Tragedy is about the experience of the acceptance of one's dependence on others, one's vulnerability, one's injurability, one's grievability, and these things as conditions for ethicality, right? Rather than limitations to it. The problem, I think, is the problem. The problem is autonomy. The problem in the belief in independence. What we're shown in tragedy are people that believe themselves autonomous and are destroyed in the process. Oedipus, first and foremost. He comes on stage, he knows who he is. He's the riddle solver. He's the king. Right? And we're shown in the tragedy the extent of his dependence on the past, and insofar as he disavows that past, he's destroyed by it. Right? But that destruction takes him into an experience of truth, but it's a tough truth. And linked to that, to use tragic thinking as a way of at least raising a question about this thing called philosophy, or this thing called theory, and what we might expect of it, what we might demand of it, and to demand perhaps something else. Not certainty or new forms of univocal explanation, but something more like an experience of ambiguity. Okay, the last quote is from Vidal-Naquet and Vidal-Naquet. They say, so how does the human being present themselves in tragedy? Tragedy conveys a sense of the contradictions that rend the divine universe, the social and political world, and the whole domain of values, and it thus presents man himself, the human being himself, as a tauma, a dainon. This word dainon, uncanny, is the word that, or strange, is the word at the heart of Heidegger's interpretation of tragedy. Right? I mean, Antigone in the Antigone says, dainon ta koinon, the common is strange. Right? So something about the movement into strangeness that happens in tragedy. The uncanny one, some kind of an incomprehensible, baffling monster, both an agent and the one acted upon, guilty and innocent, dominating the whole of nature with his industrious mind, yet incapable of controlling himself, lucid and yet blinded by a frenzy sent by the gods. Right? I'm going to be trying to sort of make good on that quote as we move through Oedipus tomorrow. But so the hero in tragedy is not the solution to a problem. The hero is a problem. The hero is a riddle. The hero is an enigma. And that's us. We're that enigma. We're that riddle. We're that incomprehensible monster who both acts and is acted upon, innocent and yet guilty. And I think that there's an enormous number of ways in which that can be, that sort of ambiguity at the level of one's subjectivity can be productive, interesting, but also perhaps more suggestively in relationship to current social and political situations, that if we think of ourselves as being in the right and the other side as being in the wrong, then we're wrong. Right is on both sides. The difficulty of thinking politically is thinking a situation where right is on both sides. And we're in a situation of conflict, and that's what politics is. Right? It becomes a question of how we play that out. And if we think about the multiple complexities and ambiguities of the situations that we've been sort of living through the last 6 months with what's happening in North Africa, or again, think about this. I mean, talk about the politics of lamentation, of grief, where the funeral has become politicized in the most extraordinary way. Right? And where we have situations, and now we're immune to it every fucking day. There's a new situation where people are being shot at in funerals. Right? The carrying of a coffin has become an act of political dissent. And those people that are mourners are allowed that they're targets for, whatever, security force or whatever. Now, there's a sense in which that situation is one which tragedy can at least illuminate. It's not going to offer a resolution of it, but it can at least illuminate that. I've talked far too much. That's your time. I've sort of said everything I wanted to say for the next 12 hours. So it's sort of, such is anxiety. Any thoughts out there?
So I try to understand what you're getting at, trying to think about what theory can do, and maybe philosophy is trying to reconnect with tragedy itself, not looking for some sort of universal answer, but of embracing of the ambiguity and questioning the sound of tragedy. Isn't that at the heart, somewhat of, you said Socrates pretends like he doesn't know, but he knows. So isn't it essentially a part of philosophy in the beginning of thinking itself to not know and to embrace the ambiguity to begin to think?
Yeah.
Isn't that what theory is? I would think what maybe why there was a certain shift to move from an obsessive naming of philosophy as such to theory in the past 30 or 40 years to reconnect with its connection with thinking?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go into Plato this afternoon, and if we don't know what tragedy means, we certainly don't know what Plato's up to.
Okay.
Right? We're presented with. First thing to say is that tragedy is dramatic performance. Right? Philosophy begins as dramatic performance.
Okay.
Tragedy is indirect communication, where we're not given a perspective. We don't know what we're meant to think. We're meant to sympathise with Oedipus or not. We don't know. Socratic dialogue could be understood in very similar ways. There's a whole school of schools of interpretation of Plato which would insist that what Plato's up to is ironical. Right? Therefore, what Socrates is doing is ironical. Therefore, what he's arguing for is not what he's arguing for.
Plato's not a Platonist.
Plato's not a Platonist. Plato might be showing Socrates' apparent argument for the philosopher king might be to show that there is no such thing as a philosopher king, and the very idea is ludicrous. This is a development that you found in the school that followed, I mean, the Straussians in particular in the US, and they're not so easily dismissed, right? Those people, well, they're a weird bunch, but they read their text. So tragedy begins as a competitive discourse philosophy begins as a competitive discourse to tragedy. And there's a way of viewing philosophy as fundamentally agnostic, fundamentally sort of skeptical enterprise. And then you can do what, someone like Hannah Arendt does brilliantly and persuasively. She says, well, there's Socrates and then there's Plato. Plato was this pro-totalitarian that believed all this weird shit about the state and the laws and the need to train guardians in a sort of quasi-militaristic way. Socrates was just this guy that wandered around the agora asking difficult questions, and he was a Democrat. Right? So there's a way of dividing that up, but there are ways of also complicating that. But what is theory? I mean, if we put Plato to one side, theory is contemplation. Right? It's the life of, the bios theoretikos is the contemplative life, and the promise that philosophy made in some of the pre-Socratics, Empedocles and others, and in Epicurean schools and the other schools, through to really the rise of Christianity, is the divine life, the life of the gods. That's theory. You shouldn't forget that. You might think, well, so that was the promise. If you joined the school, the Epicurean school, in the 4th century, the promise was that you'd have the life of the gods, meaning that you'd have a comprehension of nature, right? And that comprehension of nature would give you the ethical disposition of calm, of tranquility, and that would be a godlike life. And this is what's promised at the end of Aristotle's Ethics, right? Which people have been trying to work out for years. What's the relationship between practical life in Aristotle, the life of the city, and the life of contemplation? Because the ethics ends with the idea of basically the highest value is contemplation, and the highest experience of contemplation, higher than you have with your friends, is the dialogue of the soul with itself. And that's the life of a god. Right? So when and I'm not dismissive of that. I'm not. I think these urges are really interesting. I think the idea of theory as a fusion with the divine is. I don't believe that, but I find it an enormously compelling thought. I'm reading Philip K. Dick's magnum opus, Exegesis, which is coming out in November. I'm writing some annotations on the text for the publication. It's really interesting. But Dick has this experience of fusion with the divine in 1974, and then spends 8,000 pages elaborating this in obsessive detail, going back to Plato, Eckhart, and it's sort of and you can dismiss it, right, as the ravings of a sort of acid freaking, which he was. But it's also, there's a temptation, there's something which is, he thinks that, as it were, theory can see through into the divine, right? I don't think, you can't, what do you say, that guy's mad?
Rotten with perfection is what Kenneth Burke would say, rotten with perfection.
Right, yeah.
At the same time, a lot of his stories, it's not about seeing through, but it's seeing through and then continuously seeing through to where they're really, literally, you're never going to get to the end point or the divine.
Yeah.
I mean, he's caught between these. Essentially, could we say that Dick himself is sort of an essential tragic character? I mean, the heroes himself. Is he writing tragedies?
In this, I can't, because I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement before I could. I was saying this to Michael yesterday. Before I could, I can't actually say anything about that. But he describes what he's doing in terms of tragedy.
Okay.
He's reading Coleridge on tragedy and odd things. And what it's interesting about this about him is just because I'm reading it and I'm thinking about it. But I'm very interested in these sorts of experiences that people would dismiss. Schreber. We were talking about President Schreber. I'm very interested in Schreber. Same sort of thing. What we see in tragedy are people that believe themselves divine at some level, or who are described as divine. Oedipus, when he comes on stage, doesn't describe himself as a god, but the chorus say to him, "For us, you are a god." He doesn't disagree. He's sort of, okay, a god. Solve the riddles of the city. Yeah. And then we show him being dismantled piece by piece and raging at every stage. That's the other thing which is essential to tragedy. We find people who are, in psychoanalytic terms, perverts insofar as they believe they're unified with some divine other, and then they're torn apart piece by piece. But at each stage, it's not that Oedipus says, "Oh, okay, I killed my father. Oh, right, okay, mother. Okay, right, fine. It'll be a very short play." And he rages, and it's the anger which is interesting. I find. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. Because another thing that philosophy has difficulties with is excessive affect, right? Excessive rage. You have to moderate your behaviour from Plato through to the Stoics and beyond. Through to Spinoza, it becomes a question of the right measure of emotion. Because in tragedy, people are just wild. They're just letting it go. And when you let it go, what happens is that the past has takes its revenge on you. Right? It's what I call the logic of being an arsehole. Right? Those moments when you become an arsehole and you rage up in anger, right? It's at that moment when the past, as it were, shoots through you in a way. You become that thing that you like to disavow. Often your parents needn't be, but maybe you get the picture. So, another way of thinking about tragedy is we're presented with people that are arseholes. And we're all arseholes. And there's a sort of, deconstruction of arseholism. Something like that. I can't believe I said that. It's on tape, it's on
the archives.
I got that from arseholism is from an evening in Austin, Texas. There was a band on stage, and they were talking about this guy, I forget his name, was talking about arseholism. Anyway, any other thoughts? We can begin with discussion last time. No, we can begin with discussion next time before we go into places. We need a chance to think things up.
Changing, making a shift, but I don't know, is there any relationship, or have you discovered any relationship between what we don't know about the music and the ghostness?
Yeah, no, there's very little Because
The reason I'm asking is that
yeah,
music is always beyond thinking. I mean, there's no way
Yeah.
you can even put writing or words to it or whatever, but
yeah,
the music is the most emotional, very emotional. I mean, it's
hmm
the closest, at least, the least of the possibilities of making it intelligible. You can, but that one takes you. And I always find that that's what a ghost is about. You know, when the ghosts appear, ghosts are not intelligible. There should not be.
yeah,
If you understand them, they are not ghosts anymore.
yeah.
So I don't know if there's any, especially going back into the
That's a
tragedy.
very good question. Because at one level, you know, that would make you a Schopenhauerian or a Nietzschean, right? Which is fine. Music is the closest, is the highest form of art because it gives us access to the will or the unconscious.
I'm not sure if it's the highest, but it's the least.
It's related to affect and emotion in some essential way. I'm not unsympathetic to that view, and it is ghostly. The thing which really interests me is I'm forgetting I read a paper recently where they talk about 26 variations on the scale in Greek. The Greek listeners would have. Any records of music in ancient Greece shows that the Greek ear was incredibly highly attuned to differences of sound. There was a revolution in the 4th century with how the scale was reproduced, and a couple of extra notes were added. And this was the Euripidean. This is the Euripidean revolution, and we probably couldn't even hear it. So the ear has changed, right? So what we hear? We couldn't even perhaps hear what was heard as music. I mean, clearly the music wasn't very loud. We're talking about pipes and maybe a stringed instrument played softly as accompaniment to the words. We're not sure. Some people think it was just when the chorus was speaking there was music, but we're not sure. But the interesting thought there is that the capacities of the ear are not constant. Right? Music is not a constant feature. Right? We hear different things. And maybe our ears are not as finely attuned as other people's ears. It's like with similar things say with colour. I mean, the first reports of colour blindness are in the late 17th century, I believe. Nobody colourblind before then? Well, probably not. There were people that were colourblind, but there was no register of colour blindness. So then people became colourblind when the concept was baptized. So, and the ghost, yeah, there is something ghostly there.
What is a ghost?
Oh.
I know what a ghost is, but
Yeah, a ghost is, let's say, on the view that I was developing here, this idea of, psychagogia, this idea of the conjuring up of souls. That a ghost is someone that refuses to respect the distinction between the living and the dead. Right? The spectral, in Derrida's sense, right? This is what he was preoccupied with in the last 50 odd years of his work.
The ready known.
Yeah, exactly. The ghost is the one who returns. The one who returns. And which means that the dead aren't dead and the living aren't living. And that's the situation in so many tragedies. That we don't know whether we're dead or alive. Antigone, in a sense, is dead from the start. Well, she's told she's dead. Her dad says, look, I mean, the last speech in Oedipus says, I found out the truth about myself. He said, well, the sons, they'll be okay. They're boys. They'll find their way. But my daughters, what's going to become of my daughters? Bring me my daughters, he said. He demands for them to be brought back. And the last words of the player from Crown says, you're no longer master here. You can't dictate your wishes to us. But it's oh shit! What was the lead into that? Oh god, I forgot something. Just sleeplessness having its effects. Oh gosh. What was I just saying before then? It's gone. Oh, the living and the dead, yeah. So that she's told she's dead from the very start by her father. No one's going to marry you. You'll never be a bride. You're not really. She's a virgin, no virgin, wife, no wife. That's how she's described in Greek. Virgin, no virgin, wife, no wife. She's a contradiction. She's a baffling, incomprehensible monster. So she knows she's dead, and she moves forward. So the characters in tragedies are possessed by ghosts. And I find that really. I don't know. I just think that's. I just think we are. I mean, we move forward that way. You move forward, and there are these ghosts that refuse to die.
And Freud's thinking it's a compromise formation. A compromise formation.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else are we going to do with this, you know?
Yeah.